When I asked Father Justin if I could preach on this particular day, I thought that today's parable was one of my favorite parables. That parable is a cousin of this one, in which a bouncer at the door of a wedding feast denies a late group of friends entry and casts them into outer darkness, where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. Our parable starts: the kingdom of heaven may be compared to a king who gave a wedding banquet for his son. He sent slaves to call those who had been invited to the wedding banquet, but they would not come. Before we get any further, I would like to address the relationship between the king and his slaves. People who listened to Jesus would have known that leaders enslaved people that they conquered as a part of war. The population of Rome at Jesus' time was a quarter enslaved people, and most likely many of the people who listened to Jesus were or had been enslaved. Although the criteria that enslaved you in the Roman world was military conquest, and the criteria that enslaved you in the American pre-Civil War context was a social and then legal category called race, the violence that maintained enslavement was violence in both cases. How does the kingdom of heaven include slavery? How is this kingdom any different from kingdoms on earth? How is the kingdom of heaven like a man, a ruler, who sends his troops in not only to kill the killers of his enslaved people, but to burn a city down? Fire doesn't just destroy buildings, it destroys homes, shops, farms, and creatures who don't flee in time. Creatures and people with no say in the original conflict. Fires block out the sun, clog our lungs and our sinuses, and change the color of the sunlight. Burning a city may have been a typical practice for this king and his peers, but that does not minimize the terror and death that fire wreaks on everyone who has to witness it, let alone live through it. What do we 21st century people do with this story? Violence will not go away if we ignore it. No, we must name it so that we can begin to process it. In the first part of this parable, the expected guests do not show up. The oxen and calves have been slaughtered, and Jesus did not have to say this, but I feel like I do. There was no refrigeration. The king had killed plural oxen and plural calves. This is a lot of meat. Sometimes, back before COVID tide, I would throw parties. And for these parties, I would usually make food. Usually one meat dish and a bunch of veggie dishes. And I don't know about you, but there's always that time when you realize that you've made all this food and you can hear your lamb that you're braising simmering away in the oven. All your fava beans are shelled and nobody's come yet. There's this pause where you think, what if nobody shows up? What if they were all just saying they would, but really they don't want to? That actually happened to this king, except worse. Much worse. He had way more leftovers than I have ever had. And the second time he sent out invitations, the people that he was inviting killed the people that he sent. Word gets back to the king, so he kills the killers and burns their city. In December of 2017, my mother died of brain cancer. I admit, I am still angry at some of my mother's cousins that I invited to her funeral for not showing up. After all, one only dies once. However, I do not think that I want to murder them and burn their cities to the ground. I still do not know what to do with my anger and all my other feelings. However, my mother's funeral itself was reverent and appropriate, and the lunch afterwards put the FUN back into funeral. I thought that in order to transition from the eating part of the lunch to the reminiscing part, that I would play the Beatles' When I'm 64 as a darkly ironic joke because my mother had died 2 months minus 1 day short of her 64th birthday. I played the song. Nobody got the joke. Instead, they started singing along, starting a Beatles sing-along that lasted several songs. That set the tone right for sharing stories. But enough funerals, let's get back to the wedding feast. There is a man who got in past the guards with his street clothes on, and the king instructs him to be bound and thrown into outer darkness where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. This part actually was the part of the parable that I originally gravitated towards because it speaks about boundary setting. The invite clearly said, wedding attire. The man arrived in street attire. The man was bounced. Simple. He showed up unprepared, so he was not allowed to stay. Sometimes, when I've had a clear boundary set, it's been difficult for me. When I've had to set a boundary and tell someone that they were not welcome to be close to me anymore, I have wept and gnashed my teeth. Boundaries are important, but they are not always easy. For a little over a year, right after I graduated from college and was coming to terms with some traumas I'd gone through during my childhood, I held my mother at arm's length. I lived in Brooklyn, she in Berkeley, and I often had Thanksgiving with the same relatives that snubbed my invitation to her funeral. During this time, I stopped opening up to her and letting her into the tides and waves of my life. I did not visit. I needed the space. I could tell that she didn't want to push me, but that this time was very, very difficult for her. Then one day, I was visiting my great uncle in London, the site of one of those traumas, and I reached out to her again. I had been feeling weighted down, grieved all that week, and I couldn't figure out why. It was beautiful. All of London was perfumed, in bloom, and I was seeing my friends from Shakespeare summer school. Then it hit me. This was the 10-year anniversary to the week of that trauma. I used a long-distance calling card and mourned on the phone with my mother for what had happened to me in London. And my mother was there, letting me be me on the other end of the phone, across the ocean and a continent, right next to my heart. After that, our relationship had new life. Our relationship was never any less our relationship during the time I kept her at a distance. She respected that. It was more difficult in some ways, but being distant did not stop us from loving each other. Is the kingdom of heaven like when a daughter puts space between herself and her mother and suddenly knows she has to reach out to her mother, and her mother is just there for her? Just there? Or is the kingdom of heaven like a daughter who thinks she's making a dark joke about her mother's untimely death, but everybody at the party thinks it's an invitation to belt out the songs of their youth? The kingdom of heaven is not a place in a specific section of the atmosphere, but in our bodies and in our souls. The kingdom of heaven is here, now, in all our darkness and pain, as well as our songs and laughter. It's understandable to forget that the resurrection involves death. For anyone who has experienced death, you know that there is nothing like it. I personally bristle at euphemisms like passed away or to lose someone, because death is a goneness and a presence that is not like seeing a pine cone pass away down the creek in a game of poo sticks, or like when you lose your favorite cardigan at your cousin's wedding in Minnesota. I wish I had that cardigan back, and I even called the hotel to see if it turned up in the lost and found, because that is a possibility. Because neither my cardigan nor my pine cone are dead. They were never alive. No, death is death. That year after college, I had to face that my mother was not the perfect parent. And this idea of her had to die, and I had to mourn it, to let it go. We have no official stories in the Gospels about what it was like for Jesus after he died. But we do know one thing. We know that he descended to the dead. God's beloved child, in whom God's heart swells with parental pride, went to the place of the dead. There is no place in existence where God's great love for creation is not. That doesn't mean that every place is filled with puppies and kittens' love. No. From what I know, the places where love is plainest, where I feel the kingdom of heaven's steady breath, it's where love is the love of showing up when it's hard. The author of the letter to the Philippians tells the congregation at Philippi to keep turning their thoughts and trust to God. Prayer practice, I have found, is kind of like tending a garden. If you do it every day, sometimes it'll seem like it's just pulling weeds, and other times it blooms and things take root that you never thought that you were tending. What kind of garden does the Holy Spirit call you to tend in the hours of your days? Is the divine wisdom welcoming you into deeper community with the divine within yourself? Or does she push you into deeper community with other people? Ask any of the gardeners in this community, and you will find that there is no one way to tend a garden, except to keep coming back to it. Inside of us, there are things that upset us and things that calm us down. We're always living in the resurrection story of healing, death, and new life. And Christ is in every part. Even when the powers and principalities of this world bind us and throw us into outer darkness, Christ is there. Yes, we are still bound. Yes, tears are still in our eyes, but Christ is by our side. What a difference Christ makes.